The wind moved strangely through the pines that bordered the forgotten town of Hollow Creek, a sound not quite like breath, not quite like whispering, but something in between. Travelers who took the wrong turn off Route 19 often spoke of it later, their voices uneasy, insisting that the woods were watching them. Some said they saw shapes moving in the fog, others swore they heard laughter, small, childlike, and wrong. But the locals, what few of them remained, just called it the Brant air. Long before the maps erased this place, before its last post office shuttered, Hollow Creek was home to one of the strangest bloodlines in the Midwest, the Brant family. They lived in a sprawling farmhouse built on land so fertile it seemed to breathe, and for generations, no one questioned how so many of them looked exactly alike. Pale skin, wide-set eyes, a kind of beauty that bordered on the unnatural. Then came the stories, quiet at first, that all of them descended from one man, their uncle. Elias Brant had returned from the war with nothing but a Bible, a jar of preserved animal hearts, and an idea he claimed God himself had whispered to him in a fever, that the world outside was tainted, and only through pure union could his blood remain uncorrupted. His nieces obeyed him. They bore him children. And those children bore more. No one knows what became of them after the Great Flood of 1937 washed through the valley, taking their farmhouse with it. But sometimes, when the mist rises at dawn and the air tastes like copper, people swear they can still see faces peering through the fog, faces too similar to be strangers. They say the Brants never left Hollow Creek. They just learned how to hide better. The forgotten county was not a place found easily, and that was by design. Decades ago, it was simply erased from maps, its name scratched out, its borders absorbed by the surrounding towns as if it had never existed. The locals whispered that it had been done to contain something, not a crime, not a plague, but a legacy. Hidden in the thick woods and endless cornfields of the American Midwest, the county had once thrived in the late 1800s, its people hardworking, God-fearing, and proud of their independence. But over the years, travelers began to avoid it, roads crumbled into dirt, and even the mail stopped coming. One by one, families left until only a handful remained, those bound by blood and something far darker. The story always began the same way when told around campfires or over whiskey glasses, that the county was cursed, not by witches or ghosts, but by its own kin. People claimed there was a family that had grown too close, too proud of their lineage, believing they were chosen to remain pure when the rest of the world was rotting with sin. They built their homes far from the main road, their barns hidden behind thick trees, and they rarely came into town. The few who did said their eyes were the same pale gray, their skin untouched by sun, and that they spoke with the same strange calm that made others uneasy. Children would vanish in nearby towns, livestock would be found mutilated, and every time someone went looking for answers in that forgotten place, they never came back the same. By the early 1900s, the county was empty in every official record. The courthouse had burned down, taking with it birth and death certificates, land deeds, and census records. Some said the fire was deliberate, set by men in suits who came from the capital to make sure no trace of the Brant family, or whatever was left of them, could be tied to the living world. Yet hunters still stumbled upon remnants, a rusted mailbox half buried in soil, a stone foundation with markings that no archaeologist could identify, and bones, small, brittle bones scattered under the leaves as if the earth itself had rejected them. When storms rolled over that land, thunder carried differently there, like voices buried beneath the sound. Locals claimed the lightning avoided the valley altogether, splitting instead around its borders as if nature itself refused to touch it. The forgotten county had become a hollow place, a scar on the map where no birds sang and no wind felt natural, a place erased not from geography, but from memory itself. The old photograph surfaced in the most unassuming way, tucked between yellowed pages of a property ledger in the Hollow Creek Historical Society's archives. It was a small, grainy image, no larger than a postcard, showing a family gathered in front of a weathered farmhouse. The corners were frayed, the surface mottled with age, but the faces were eerily clear. At first glance, it seemed like nothing more than a snapshot from the late 1800s, a proud Midwestern family posing stiffly, their expressions flat under the long exposure of the camera. But the historian who found it, a quiet man named Arthur Clem, noticed something wrong. The same man appeared twice. Once standing at the far left, his hand on the shoulder of a young woman, and again in the center, holding a child. The faces were identical, not similar, identical down to the faint scar under the left eye. Arthur assumed it was a photographic error, a double exposure perhaps, but something about it unsettled him. When he compared it to other photographs in the archive, he found the same face recurring in church gatherings, in school portraits, even in a faded newspaper clipping from 1910. The problem was that the photographs spanned over 50 years. Each time, the man appeared unchanged, the same hollow eyes, the same solemn stare, as if frozen outside the reach of time. His name, scribbled on the back of one of the photos, was Elias Brant. Arthur dug deeper, tracing records of the Brant family. He discovered that nearly every census entry was missing, every marriage certificate lost or burned, every family tree cut short at the same generation. It was as though the Brants had been systematically erased. Yet the faces in the photographs did not lie. The same features passed through each decade, not through descendants, but through repetition. Elias appeared again and again, sometimes older, sometimes not, surrounded by different sets of children and women, each bearing his eyes. Late one night, under the dim hum of a desk lamp, Arthur magnified one of the photographs and saw what he hadn't before: faint symbols carved into the wooden frame of the farmhouse behind the family. They looked like concentric circles intersected by jagged lines, and at the center, a single symbol that resembled an eye. When he checked the surrounding landscape, he realized something chilling. The same pattern was visible in aerial photographs of the old Brant property, formed by the layout of their fields, barns, and burial sites. Arthur's colleagues dismissed his findings as superstition, but he couldn't shake the feeling that the man in those photos was still out there, that whatever Elias Brant had done to preserve his bloodline had not ended with the burning of Hollow Creek, and that the camera had only captured what it was never meant to see. Elias Brant's return to Hollow Creek in 1892 was spoken of like the coming of a storm no one expected but everyone somehow felt. The town had not seen him for nearly 20 years, not since he had left as a gaunt teenager after the death of his mother. When he came back, he was a man transformed, tall, with eyes too pale for comfort, carrying a worn leather trunk and a presence that silenced rooms. He said little, moved slowly, and when he did speak, his words carried the gravity of scripture, though no one could recall which scripture he was quoting. People remembered him walking down the dirt road toward the family farmhouse, its shutters rotting and its windows blackened, as if the house itself had been waiting for him to come home. He told anyone who asked that he had fought in the war, though he never said which one, and that he had seen things not meant for ordinary eyes. He claimed to have been guided by a voice, not the voice of man, but of blood, that called him back to reclaim what had been lost. Some said he had spent time with preachers who dabbled in unholy rites, others whispered he had wandered too long in foreign lands and brought something back with him. Whatever the truth, the change in him was undeniable. His skin looked bloodless, his hands bore strange markings, and his eyes carried the stare of someone who had seen death and made peace with it. Elias began visiting his nieces soon after his return. They were young women then, orphaned after their parents' mysterious deaths, and lived scattered across the valley. Neighbors would see him at their doorsteps, his hat in hand, his voice low and calm. One by one, the girls stopped attending church, stopped visiting town, and soon after, moved into the Brant farmhouse with their uncle. When questioned, Elias said God had given him a new purpose, to rebuild the family in its purest form. He called it divine will, the fulfillment of a promise written in their bloodline long before their births. At night, lanterns glowed in the upper windows of the farmhouse, and the air carried the smell of burning herbs and something else, metallic and sharp. People heard chanting through the trees, a low hum that made the dogs restless and the children cry. By the following spring, the women began to show signs of pregnancy, each claiming that Elias was their chosen redeemer. The pastor tried to confront him once, but he never returned from that visit. The townsfolk stopped asking questions after that, and Elias Brant became less of a man and more of a legend whispered about whenever the wind moved strangely through the fields. The family pact began in whispers, born from the strange gatherings Elias Brant held within the decaying walls of the old farmhouse. His nieces, isolated from the rest of Hollow Creek and bound to him by both blood and grief, had grown to believe his words were sacred. Elias spoke to them in the language of scripture, twisting verses until sin sounded like salvation. He told them that the world outside their land had become corrupt, that mankind had fallen too far from purity, and that God had chosen their bloodline to begin anew. The Brants, he said, were special, marked by the divine to carry the first untainted lineage into the next age. The pact was not written on paper, but sealed with a ritual that only they witnessed, one that bound their lives, and their bodies, to his will. The women had been conditioned by years of isolation, by the hypnotic cadence of Elias's voice and the strange comfort of belonging to something bigger than themselves. He preached that love was weakness but devotion was eternal. Under his guidance, they began to see themselves not as victims of his desires, but as vessels chosen to preserve his blood. He called them the keepers of the first flame, a name that filled them with pride and terror in equal measure. When the oldest niece bore his first child, Elias gathered them all around and declared the newborn the proof of divine favor. From that night onward, their pact became a living covenant. Rumors began to spread in the nearby towns about what went on within the Brant property. Traders passing through claimed to hear the sound of singing late into the night, voices overlapping in perfect harmony, rising and falling like some ancient hymn. Hunters reported seeing the family gathered in a circle in the fields at dawn, their heads bowed as Elias spoke words in a language none recognized. When the sheriff tried to investigate, he found the gates to the property locked and the women inside smiling through the windows as if nothing were wrong. He left after Elias told him, in a tone that froze the air, that God's work is not to be questioned by the dying. The family pact became more than an oath, it became a doctrine. Elias's nieces began to write his words into notebooks, recording his teachings and the rules of purity. Their lives revolved around him, their thoughts molded by his voice, their futures sealed by his hand. What began as devotion to blood became the worship of one man, and by the time the community realized what had happened, the Brant family had already disappeared behind the veil of the woods, bound forever by a promise that no one else could understand. The children of the Hollow were unlike any others the region had ever seen. When the first of them were born, the midwife who helped deliver them fled Hollow Creek before dawn and never spoke of what she had witnessed. The Brant farmhouse, hidden deep within the woods, became a place where births took place in whispers, with windows covered and candles burning through the night. The babies came silent into the world, their eyes open before their first breath, their skin pale as uncarved wax. As they grew, it became clear that something about them was wrong in a way no one could name. They learned to speak late, but when they did, their voices were steady and eerily synchronized, as if they shared one thought among many. Their faces bore the unmistakable mark of the Brant bloodline: wide gray eyes, hollow cheeks, and a sameness that made it hard to tell one child from another. Elias called them the perfected, claiming that they carried no trace of the world's corruption. To him, they were living proof that his doctrine of pure blood was divine truth. The women, still under his control, accepted his every word and raised the children according to his teachings. They were forbidden to play with outsiders or even speak to travelers who passed the property. The children grew up knowing only the language of the Brants, a blend of scripture, coded symbols, and whispered chants. They did not cry when punished, did not laugh when others would, and seemed to possess an unnerving calm that unsettled anyone who saw them. Locals who occasionally caught sight of the Brant children in the woods described a strange grace in their movements. They said the children would stand perfectly still, watching without blinking, and vanish between the trees without making a sound. On moonless nights, farmhands claimed to hear them singing a slow, melodic hum that drifted across the valley and made the livestock restless. The melody was wordless but carried a rhythm that felt deliberate, almost ceremonial. Those who listened too long described vivid dreams afterward of faces repeating endlessly, of blood trickling down tree bark like sap. By the time the children reached adolescence, they had begun to resemble Elias more than their mothers. Even their gestures mirrored his, their gazes carrying the same unnerving steadiness that silenced any who dared meet it. The women aged rapidly while Elias remained unchanged, as if his vitality was being drawn from them or their offspring. The townspeople started calling the family's land the Hollow, not because of the geography, but because it felt like a place emptied of soul. The Brant children continued to grow in silence, pale mirrors of the man who had made them, walking proof that something unnatural had taken root in the heart of Hollow Creek. The isolation of the Brant family did not happen overnight. It unfolded like a slow tightening of the woods around them. After the birth of Elias's children and the rumors that followed, the family began retreating further into their land, abandoning any pretense of connection with the outside world. The dirt path that once led to the farmhouse grew wild and overgrown, its entrance eventually blocked by a gate of twisted iron that Elias himself had forged. Locals said it wasn't just meant to keep people out, but to keep something inside. The family stopped attending church, stopped trading with neighboring farms, and even stopped acknowledging the seasonal fairs that had once brought the community together. It was as if the Brants had chosen to vanish while still alive. Over time, their world became self-contained. Elias divided the property into sections, building crude wooden structures that stretched into the woods, one for the women, one for the children, and one, it was said, where no one but he ever entered. Smoke rose from their chimneys at odd hours, and strange, low lights could be seen flickering through the trees at night. Hunters who strayed too close spoke of hearing murmured chants or the sound of digging, always followed by sudden silence. No one dared cross the property line after that. The sheriff, once bold enough to investigate the reports, returned pale and trembling, saying only that the family was not to be disturbed again. Inside the compound, Elias ruled with an authority that felt both religious and tyrannical. He told his followers that the world beyond their fences was diseased, that to leave was to die a spiritual death. The women obeyed him completely, their devotion rooted in both fear and the belief that their isolation was holy. The children were taught that the outside world was filled with demons that sought to corrupt their blood, and that only by staying within the compound could they remain pure. By the early 1900s, the Brant family's presence had faded from public memory, surviving only as a rumor passed among travelers and drifters who claimed to have seen movement in the trees where no one should have been. When the Great War ended, new settlers came through the region and spoke of stumbling upon strange fences deep in the woods, covered in symbols carved into the bark of old oaks. They said the air there was heavy, thick with a silence that pressed against the chest. What had once been a family home had become a fortress of secrecy, a world within a world where the laws of men no longer applied and where the Brant's own creation had turned into a living cage. The missing census of the 1930s became one of the earliest official signs that something was terribly wrong in Hollow Creek. Every 10 years, government workers were sent through the region to record the population, property, and birth records of rural families scattered across the Midwest. Hollow Creek had always been a strange footnote on those forms, a handful of names, mostly the Brants, who seemed to occupy more land than any family needed. But when the census takers arrived that year, they found a silence so complete it bordered on unnatural. The road to the Brant property was barely visible, swallowed by trees and vines. The farmhouse stood in the clearing like a carcass, its windows black, its roof sagging under the weight of years. Yet the air felt charged, as if someone was still inside, watching. The census team split up to survey the land. They found evidence of life, dishes left on a table, a lamp still filled with oil, laundry hanging stiff on a line. But there were no people. The walls inside the farmhouse were covered in markings, crude symbols carved deep into the wood as though scratched there in desperation or ritual. Circles intersected by jagged lines, triangles filled with spirals, and over the doorframes, strange inscriptions written in ash. Every room smelled faintly of iron, and in the children's quarters, dolls sat arranged in rows facing the door, each one painted with the same wide grey eyes that had defined the Brant lineage. One of the census men swore he heard whispering from behind the walls, but when they tore through the boards, they found nothing except hollows filled with old bones. Their reports, later submitted to the state office, were inconsistent. Some claimed the property was abandoned for decades, while others insisted the fires in the hearth were still warm when they entered. One man never finished his documentation, leaving his form half-written and stained with something dark. He disappeared on the way back to town, his body never found. The final record simply listed the Brant family as missing, presumed deceased. But those who read the report noticed an odd detail: the population count for Hollow Creek was marked unknown, the only entry of its kind in the region. Afterward, the government ordered the area sealed off, citing contamination from old well water and unsafe terrain. Locals didn't believe that explanation. They said the officials had seen something inside the Brant house that they didn't want the public to know. Not long after, the few remaining structures were torched in a controlled burn, but for years afterward, people claimed that on still nights, The faint orange glow of fire could still be seen flickering between the trees where the census men once walked and never returned. The whispering trees became one of the most enduring legends surrounding the Brant family after their disappearance. For years, locals avoided the woods near the old Brant property, claiming that the air there felt heavy and wrong, as if the land itself held its breath. Hunters and travelers who ventured too close spoke of voices that seemed to drift from the trees, soft at first, like the sound of leaves rustling, but forming words when the wind died down. They were never clear, never loud, but always human. Some said the whispers called their names, others that they mimicked the voices of loved ones long dead. No matter how far people ran, the voices followed until they reached the main road, where the air would suddenly feel lighter, as if the forest itself had boundaries no one could cross. Old-timers in nearby towns swore that the whispering began shortly after the last known census team vanished. They believed the Brant family had never truly died, that their souls were bound to the land, trapped in the trees that grew from the soil where they once buried their dead. The pattern of the forest even seemed unnatural. The trees grew in strange spirals, forming circles around the ruins of the farmhouse, their trunks twisted as if reaching toward something beneath the earth. During storms, the wind would make the branches creak in rhythm, like breathing. There were reports from loggers who claimed the bark was marked with human shapes, faint outlines of faces pressed into the wood as though the trees had absorbed what was left of those who vanished. In the 1950s, a small group of explorers from a nearby university entered the area to study the supposed acoustic phenomena. They brought with them recording equipment and camping gear, determined to debunk the stories. Only one of them returned, delirious and frostbitten despite it being late spring. He was found wandering along the highway, repeating a single phrase, "They're still talking." When the tapes were recovered, most were blank except one, which contained faint murmuring between bursts of static. Audio experts later described it as impossible. The whispering seemed to form words, echoing the names of the missing census workers. Locals soon began to avoid the entire stretch of land. The highway that once passed near Hollow Creek was rerouted after several drivers crashed under mysterious circumstances, each claiming afterward that they saw figures standing in the woods, pale and still. On quiet nights, the few remaining residents claimed they could still hear faint voices carried by the wind, echoing from the hollow where the Brants once lived. The whispers were not always mournful, sometimes they sounded like laughter, as if whatever remained in those trees no longer remembered being human at all. When the documentary crew arrived decades later, Hollow Creek was little more than a name lost to memory. By then, the Brant story had become local folklore, a whispered legend told in bars and roadside diners about a cursed family and a town that had simply vanished. The crew, 5 filmmakers from Chicago, came with the intent to make a low-budget horror documentary, something that would blend myth and truth for the thrill of it. They had no idea how close the two really were. The group included a historian, a sound engineer, and a director who believed every legend hid a seed of fact. Their plan was simple: find the remains of the Brant property, capture the eerie atmosphere of the woods, and interview the last few locals who still remembered the name Hollow Creek. The deeper they drove into the Midwest, the more the air began to feel wrong. The GPS failed first, then the compass, and eventually even their cell phones lost signal. The locals they managed to speak with warned them not to go past the old highway, the one that used to run near the Brant land. They said the forest there was alive in the wrong way. But the warnings only fueled the crew's curiosity. They reached the edge of the overgrown path that once led to the Brant farmhouse just before sunset and decided to camp there for the night. From the start, strange things happened. The audio equipment picked up low murmurs even when no one spoke, and the temperature dropped suddenly whenever they approached the remains of what might have been a fence. The next day, they found remnants of structures deep in the trees, stone foundations, rusted tools, and fragments of walls carved with the same symbols mentioned in old archives. One of the filmmakers discovered a small box buried under a collapsed beam. Inside were dozens of old photographs, each showing the same man standing among children and women, unchanged across decades. The historian recognized the face immediately from records: Elias Brant. That night, the crew reviewed their footage and realized something impossible. In several frames, shapes appeared in the background, pale figures standing between the trees, watching. The sound engineer began hearing whispers through the headset, faint at first, then louder, repeating words no one else could make out. When the group tried to leave the next morning, the road they had taken in was gone, replaced by dense woods that hadn't been there before. Their last recording ended abruptly, the camera panning toward the forest as someone said, "They're still here." Months later, their abandoned van was found on the side of the highway, the inside coated with a thin layer of ash, the equipment still running, recording nothing but the steady sound of breathing. In the ruins of the Brant house, the final descent became something more than a mere exploration. It was an encounter with a lingering presence that refused to be ignored. The documentary crew, having followed the overgrown paths and twisted remnants of the property, finally arrived at what remained of the main farmhouse. Only fragments of walls remained upright, and the roof had collapsed in jagged sections, leaving the interior exposed to the elements. Yet despite the decay, there was a sense of vitality in the space, a subtle hum that seemed to pulse beneath the floorboards. Dust swirled in the shafts of light breaking through the broken windows, and the air smelled faintly of iron and damp wood, a combination that reminded the crew uncomfortably of human blood. Inside, the rooms told a story both mundane and horrifying. Children's toys were scattered across the floor, arranged with care rather than chaos: wooden soldiers, rag dolls, and marbles that gleamed despite years of neglect. In one corner, a small cradle rocked gently, though there was no wind to move it. In the kitchen, a pot still rested on a stone hearth, blackened from fire that must have burned long ago, yet ash beneath it appeared fresh. The walls bore the same carved symbols the crew had seen in photographs, circles intersecting with jagged lines, now more intricate and layered, as though someone had returned to deepen them over the years. The atmosphere was heavy, oppressive, yet strangely quiet, the silence not empty, but charged with anticipation. As the crew moved through the house, the sense of being watched grew almost unbearable. Shadows seemed to detach from corners, drifting just at the edge of vision. Then came the sound, a voice, low and breathless, whispering a single word repeatedly. "Family." The whisper echoed through the halls, sometimes coming from above, sometimes behind the crew, impossible to localize. The historian noticed footprints in the dust, too small and too pale for any adult, yet disturbingly human. One of the filmmakers, attempting to capture it on camera, caught movement in the lens, figures at the edge of the frame, pale and indistinct, yet unmistakably alive. Then, from the attic, a voice spoke clearly, in the same monotone cadence that had defined Elias Brant, "Family never dies." The crew froze, realizing that whatever had survived the years of abandonment, the burnings, and the storms was not just memory, it was living. The children of the Hollow, and perhaps Elias himself in some form, had persisted. The realization struck with a suffocating weight. The Brant bloodline, nurtured through secrecy and devotion, had not ended. They were still there, hidden, waiting, watching from the shadows between the trees and the ruins. The house, though broken, was still a home, and those who had once vanished now moved unseen through the corridors, part of the forest, part of the land, part of something that refused to be forgotten.